Hello, and welcome to another close reading at the Bill of Rights Institute. I'm Kirk Higgins, and I'm joined this week by my colleague, Tony Williams.
Kirk, how are you?
I'm doing well, Tony. I'm doing well, and I'm excited today because we get to look at two, well, I guess we're looking at one here at the start. One of the most, I think, iconic or memorable speeches in American history, the Gettysburg Address. And I'm really excited to kind of dig into it because it's a short speech. I think it's one that many of us have read and heard, but one that I think is fruitful every time you kind of take some time to go line by line and really look at what Abraham Lincoln was saying in November of 1863.
Right. I mean, I think it's about 272 words or so, and it only took about 2 minutes for him to deliver it. But yeah, it's really a document, a speech, words that really echo through the ages.
Yeah, and I want to get to that, and I hope we do talk about why it is so remembered, what it is about this speech that just sticks into the minds of so many Americans. And I hope we'll get to that, but I think our discussion will lead us there. So I think I'll go ahead and kick us off and get right to the document. Let me just go through the technical formalities here of sharing my screen. And there we go. So the speech was given on November 19th, 1863. So Tony, maybe you can give us just a little bit of background of how we get here, what happened in 1863, why is Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, and why are we waiting till November to give this speech?
Right. Well, yeah, in a nutshell, so maybe we'll back it up maybe roughly a year or so. After the Battle of Antietam, which was, a horrifically bloody battle, but one that forced Robert E. Lee to retreat out of the Northern Territory back to the South. Lincoln had the victory he needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves, of course, in the Confederacy, but not everywhere, not in the border states specifically. And by January 1st, in fact, he issues the final Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves. And this is just an incredibly important moment in American history and in the Civil War, in the history of freedom for African Americans. And Lincoln thereby achieves his goal, not only of working to save the Union, but also ending this moral blight of slavery from the country. But the war continued, of course. We have several important battles, but most notably, I want to mention in the summer of 1863, right around Independence Day in early July, the battles of Gettysburg, in which I think the casualties on both sides numbered some 50,000. So just a very important battle, but again, a very, very costly one. And the lesser known Union victory and ending the siege at Vicksburg, and thereby the Union getting full control over the Mississippi River. So some really important battles, and of course there was a cemetery being dedicated at Gettysburg, and Lincoln uses that opportunity to speak very eloquently and really reflect with the American people on the meaning of that war. The war is certainly not over. It will continue for another couple of years, but he takes that moment to reflect, and we'll obviously talk about more about what his purposes were.
Yeah, and I think that moment is really powerful. It's almost this poetic moment. If you were going to write a story about sort of the culminating moment of a war, it comes with victories for the Union in the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Vicksburg, and both coming right before the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. So, I mean, it's this culminating moment, and I think that when I read this seems to be the thing that captured Lincoln's imagination too, that in all of this horror and suffering happening on behalf of the noblest cause there could be of defending the Union and freeing African Americans from enslavement, you have these two profound victories, and it seems that kind of was inspiring Lincoln when he was writing these words, that moment was something he wanted to capture.
Right. I really think so. I mean, you think about Lincoln going to this battlefield, great cost on both sides, all Americans, and it really gives him I think he uses it to see a noble purpose in all of this horror and all of this death, and to really reflect on kind of the core essence of what the war was about, and really even more fundamentally what the American experiment was about. So it gives him that, and I think he's one of our nation's greatest poets, and wordsmiths, and so he does reflect very eloquently, very beautifully, on not only the war, and the sacrifice of the soldiers, but also on the American purpose.
Yeah, and so he begins with this poetic line, as you were saying, Lincoln as the poet. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. That 7 years is sort of a flourish, but it sort of had some intentionality to it too. I mean, it's a lot. I think it sort of sets the tone for the speech in a way. It's not. I mean, he could have said, 80 odd years ago or whatever, but that wouldn't quite have fit with the motif he was kind of going for.
Right. Well, certainly borrowing from the language of the King James Bible, which infused, the 19th century, and certainly infused Lincoln's own use of language. It's not only that poetic kind of device, and much more beautiful than just saying 87 years ago, but notice what he's referring back to, right? It's that what Lincoln calls the electric chord of the Declaration of Independence, right? Appealing back to that founding document that really animates the American soul, right? He doesn't refer just to the Constitution, he refers to the Declaration, right? What Lincoln will elsewhere call, a few years before this, the apple of gold. And the Constitution is the frame of silver around it. It's really sort of the animating ideals of the American experiment, right? Because in referring to the Declaration, he's referring to liberty for all as a universal principle, of the equality of all and their natural rights, of the idea of popular consensual self-government, right? And so all of that is really embodied in the Declaration, right? And that's what Lincoln sees as creating the new nation, because we're a nation built on an idea, right? Built on a set of ideals rather than just blood and soil. And so for him, there's so much packed into those few words in that opening, that really reveal the American regime, the purpose of America as a set of ideals.
Yeah, and I think it's worth reflecting too that Edward Everett, who was a very famous orator of the day, just before Lincoln gave the speech, had just spent 2 hours, I think it was, giving the detailed history of the war up until this moment. And here, Lincoln really wanting to focus in on meaning and not on the history or the events, does basically what Everett did in 2 hours in a half a sentence.
Yeah, exactly. And it
yeah.
said what took 2 hours took Lincoln 2 minutes.
Yeah, which I think is really powerful. And I also think it's interesting too that Lincoln avows throughout the conflict that he's fighting to save the Union. That's a union created by the Constitution of the United States. So you would think maybe he would think back to the founding being, the ratification of the Constitution in 1789. But really, for Lincoln, I think the Union was embodying those ideals of the Declaration, in that the war that was being fought was in order to preserve a true understanding of what that self-evident proposition was, which is what he goes on to say in this next sentence, right? Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And it's interesting that he says proposition, right? And I wonder if we could explore that a little bit, because I think it's a word that maybe we glance over, but I think it's a powerful one. It's not dedicated to the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, but instead to the proposition, and a proposition being a sort of a reasoned position in a debate. It is a question that you might throw out to be contested with. And it's interesting that he uses that here.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Lincoln doesn't use his language carelessly, right? Every word is chosen carefully. And he understands, I think he does understand liberty and the equality principle of all people, African Americans as well as white people, all people, right? A universal principle. And so, but he does shade the meaning a little bit, right? He goes from Jefferson and the Continental Congress's idea of a self-evident truth, right? Self-evident meaning axiomatic or obvious to people with reason. It's obvious to all humans, right? That it's a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. For Lincoln, it becomes a proposition. Why? Because, as you say, it's contested, right? Many Southerners and people like John Calhoun, Roger Taney, Stephen Douglas, they questioned whether African Americans were in fact equal to whites, and the whole war was fought over this, and so it becomes a contested idea, and so. Now, I still think that Lincoln believes it's a self-evident truth, and he still believes in the universality and the truth of those ideals, of those self-evident truths. And yet he acknowledges that it's being contested. So for him, it becomes a proposition, even if it still remains true.
Yeah, and so we go from this really abstract first paragraph, and then he gets a little bit more focused, right? So now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. This paragraph really struck me when I was rereading it, because he's essentially highlighting that we're testing that nation, right? We're testing if democracy works, because, as you were mentioning, those Southerners, the South broke away from the North on this idea of slavery. And I think, and we'll explore this a little bit more when we talk about Lincoln's second inaugural address, but really because the slave power, as it was referred to, these Southern senators and congressmen who were so dedicated to the protection of that thing, refused to acknowledge the national government's ability to resolve that question, and refused to talk about it. Famously with the gag rule, they literally refused to debate it in the houses of Congress. And so it's almost as if he's pointing to these men who have given their lives on behalf of this idea that men are created equal, and that in doing so, it is showing that that this is a cause worth doing that for, that what they're fighting for is this ideal, in going contrary to those who are rejecting it. And he's painting the South as being those who are rejecting it, rejecting this idea of equality, rejecting this idea of democracy and self-government, and rejecting all those ideals that are bound up in the Declaration.
Right, as you say, they sacrifice himself for some larger purpose, for some larger cause, and he enumerates that cause right in that first sentence, and it's really that appeal to American exceptionalism and saying, look, we're here for Republican self-government, we're here for consent and equality and freedom, and a nation so conceived. We don't know if it's going to last, right? It's being contested by the Confederacy. It's being contested in this great Civil War, and the outcome of the war is not guaranteed at this point. I think Lincoln is acknowledging that and really saying, look, this may lead to the ultimate doom of the American experiment, right? We may split off into separate governments and separate countries, and it'll be a test for self-government itself, right? The history of republics shows that they generally didn't last very long, and there weren't very many of them in history. And so, he's sharing the founders' basic pessimism that humans were meant to govern themselves, that we're just not sure if this government is going to long endure. And I think there's some other interesting things going on here, right? Notice in the first paragraph, he's in the past, and now he's going to be now he's in the present, right? And later on in the speech, he'll be in the future. So there's an interesting use of time in this, also an interesting use of space and place here. With we start off with the sort of continent, and then we get down into nation and battlefield as well. So there's a lot of interesting things as you start to sort of unpack this speech, all in a very brief speech. It's really amazing.
Yeah, it really is. And I think here, it really, in these next few lines, that really comes forward. And one word you used, when we were talking about this before we came on was pathos, right? And sort of this rhetorical flourish. And many of the things you're talking about are rhetoric. And I wonder if you could just say a word or two about rhetoric generally, but pathos specifically, and what that might mean, particularly in this instance.
Right, and so rhetoric is really important in a popular government, right? In our democratic system, right? Leaders, even fellow citizens, we need to persuade each other, right? We don't do so through force. We don't do so through violence. We persuade each other to adopt certain positions and certain policies and certain laws, and so this mastery of rhetoric and even its use is extremely important, and Lincoln is just so good at it. And the rhetorical devices he uses are also really important in shaping his speech. You see these kind of the use of triplicates. So we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hollow. And repeating a lot of alliteration and repeating certain phrases like, we cannot consecrate, but they have consecrated it, right? We cannot dedicate, but they have dedicated, and we are dedicated to the great task remaining. So that repetition is very, very important. So yeah, I mean, and we can continue to talk more about the various devices he uses, but that was back when people were classically educated, and they had the Columbian orator like Frederick Douglass, learned to read from that, and they were very interested in oratory and rhetoric, because they understood that these academic disciplines were really important in a republic.
Right. Yeah. And especially having that echo back, it's not known, I don't think, whether or not, Lincoln was thinking of Pericles' funeral oration that was given, by Pericles during the Peloponnesian Wars and has been famously passed down. But it certainly echoes of that, right? It echoes of this sentiment that, and Pericles has similar themes, saying that, when you are dedicating yourself to something higher, or when those who have died are dedicating themselves to something higher, something is happening. There's something that happens to that cause. And there's something that's happening here when it's a just and right cause that is being fought for. And I think that's why it's interesting. This first triplicate, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hollow this ground. Consecrate is a really interesting word that Lincoln employs there, right? Because it does have this almost religious reverence kind of a feeling. And earlier we had referenced the King James Bible, but it's also this. It's almost like, and I wouldn't say that Lincoln is advocating for a civic religion here, but it's certainly something that he's, he wants to call upon the highest possible thing he can in order to orient what it is that's taking place here, in order to convey to his audience, I think, the importance of not only this moment, but of this battle and of this war more broadly. And it seems that at that moment is really where he's saying, look, this is a cause worth advancing, and one that has been advanced up until this moment, and it's now on us to continue to advance that cause.
Right. No, I definitely think so. I think that he really, I mean, just the words, he so beautifully honors those who have fallen, right? But he says there's, as you said, there's work to be done, right? He talks about a great task. They've so far nobly advanced it by giving the last full measure of their devotion. I mean, very, very beautiful. But to honor the dead, we need to also be devoted to that cause that they gave their lives for. We need to continue to be devoted to it. And of course, that cause is self-government. It's universal principles. It's equality for all human beings, for all Americans. It's the freedom to live their lives as they wish, and to keep the fruits of their labor. All of these core principles must be true for all Americans, for whites as well as African Americans, for all of these free people. And he says that at the end, right? That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, right? Kind of referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, and saying that the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, right? And so there's a noble purpose that Lincoln is alluding to by honoring the war dead.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple, I think, really powerful things you touched on. One is that unfinished work, and the other is the overall sense of humility that Lincoln exudes here, and that the work to be done is humble. I mean, you can imagine, it's always dangerous doing counterfactuals in history, but you can imagine another kind of leader coming in and talking about how great this victory was, and how amazing it was that our armed forces came together and defeated those horrible Confederates, and that this victory in some measure was mine because I am the leader of this nation who finally found Meade to be the head of this army and got these soldiers recruited. And yet he doesn't do any of that. And in fact, he barely talks about the victory at all. He talks about the sacrifice. He talks about what they may have died for, giving, sort of trying to give purpose to this chaos, but he's certainly not glorifying that action in any way. He's not saying, they're great and valiant deeds of unmatched courage and patriotism. No, it's none of that. It's very much that they have done this work. And he said, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. I think is sort of a powerful pointing to that. And that what we can do is, in order to remember them, is to dedicate ourselves to the unfinished work that they who fought here so nobly advanced. Is for us rather to dedicate to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. I think is a really powerful thing, because that in a difficult thing for a leader to do, right? Because this is on the eve of an election year, right? A highly contested election year, when there's still voices within the government who don't want Lincoln to be president, who don't appreciate the way that he's conducted the war, many who wanted to end the war outright. And instead of taking a victory lap, he is saying that the only thing that we can do is to dedicate ourselves to continue to advance this noble cause for which this war was fought. I think that's a really profound thing.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And as you point out, and to come back to your earlier point that I don't think I really addressed, that there's a pathos here, right? There's the feelings of the speech, the emotions that it appeals to, very, very touching, right? And there's sort of there's sadness, right? There's melancholy in the loss here. You're right. He doesn't use it to trumpet his own greatness, or to trumpet the Union even, or to say we drove them out of the North and we're gonna drive to Richmond. He doesn't say that, right? Because there's an ethos here, right? What is the set of beliefs? Well, it's the National Union. It's all those principles we've talked about throughout our discussion here, and Lincoln believes that they're true all Americans, for those in the North and the South, for those who are white and those who are black. It's a universality of this, within the national union. And so, but he's has a very strong sense of humility in talking about and trying to achieve that noble purpose that we talked about.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And again, that unfinished work too, I think is really powerful in that as well. It's the war was still to be fought, and not only was the war to be fought, but the war is but one fight in this work towards achieving the equality that this contest is being tested on. And it goes back to that first paragraph again, him talking about this nation based on a proposition, and that proposition is and always will be tested. And so in a sense, that work is unfinished and will be unfinished, because it is for all of us to continue that work, to ensure that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish. I think that's a really profound thing. Again, that he could have said the tide has turned, and we're on our way to Richmond, and he doesn't. And not only is it not about the conflict again, but it's about something much larger than just this civil war.
Right, and that unfinished work, as you're pointing out, is not going to be accomplished just by the war, right? It's going to be accomplished by a dedication. We did, and it's going to continue in peace, right? Dedication to those principles in peace, because don't forget, the 13th Amendment is not yet passed. Certainly the idea of equal civil rights and equal voting rights. All of that will be part of this unfinished work, and economic equality and so forth. All of that is, and Lincoln knows it's not going to be easy. And it's going to be hard work. And in fact, with the hindsight of history, we know that, in some ways it continues to be unfinished. And that struggle certainly, even outlasted Reconstruction and well into, the 20th century, and even through today. So, it's a call to his fellow countrymen at the time, but really it's one that should echo through the ages, even to our own time, and maybe beyond, because we constantly need to be vigilant and ensure that these principles truly do apply to all people.
Yeah, and I'll throw out my own thoughts on, or at the beginning we talked about why this speech in particular is so remembered, and I think that's partly why. I think it gets at that same power that the simplicity of the Declaration of Independence has. That a self-evident truth that all men are created equal, right? Lincoln's Gettysburg Address seems to have that same ability to enrapture attention and draw so closely to the heart of the thing that is at stake, and in the heart of the thing that the United States was established to test and to advance, right? And I think that is the power behind this speech, I think.
Right.
But we'd love to hear from all of our viewers too, and know what you think may be the reason why this speech has become so much a part of the American civic memory.
Right. There's some great simplicity here. He's using simple words, readily understood words, but they are complex when you start digging deeper, and they have a humble and noble tone to them, and certainly a very important and noble purpose underlying them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Tony, for walking through the Gettysburg Address with me. I've really, really enjoyed it. Like I said, it's one of those that the more you come back to it, the more you find in it. And I think next time we get together, we'll be talking about another speech by Abraham Lincoln, his second inaugural address. So I'll look forward to that. So great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you, Tony. And we'll see you next time.